War, as we know it today, is measured in columns of smoke and steel tanks rolling across deserts, drones humming invisibly above cities, missiles launched with the push of a button. Empires rise and fall in the glow of firestorms, their victories recorded in chronicles and treaties. But if you strip away the technology, the maps, and the flags, what remains at the core of war? It is older than nations, older than kingdoms, perhaps as old as humanity itself. Hello there, and welcome to Bone Age. My name is Thomas. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine something far older than the clash of armies. Picture the silent darkness of a cave at night. A fire flickers low, its smoke coiling into cracks in the stone. Outside, in the blackness of the steppe, another fire burns a rival band watching from across the valley. The hunters inside your cave can feel the eyes upon them, the weight of hunger, the certainty that blood will be spilled before the season ends. There are no borders to mark, no flags to defend, only the raw edge of survival. For most of human history, war was not fought for conquest or glory, it was necessity. Every meal was a victory, every rival was a threat. To take a cave meant safety, to take water meant life. To lose either was to vanish. And yet, the first wars were never written down. They left no epic poems, no carved monuments of kings astride horses. Instead, they were carved in wounds that healed crooked, in bones shattered and buried, in the black stains of fire on stone. Archaeology whispers of them. Skulls cracked by clubs, spear points lodged in ribs, caves where entire families were wiped out in sudden raids. Each fragment of evidence is a ghost of violence, telling us that long before nations were born, humans were already locked in cycles of bloodshed. But here lies the haunting question. What if this was not an exception, not a momentary outbreak of brutality, but the constant drumbeat of existence? What if, for nearly 200 years, humanity's story was one of unending tribal war? Perhaps war was not invented in bronze or iron. Perhaps it was always there, in every sharpened stone, every fire brandished in the dark. Maybe conflict was not a choice, but an inheritance, stretching back to the dawn of our kind. And that brings us to the story we will explore tonight, the Caveman Wars, a saga of blood and survival written not in books, but in scars. Step back with me into a world that feels half lit, half remembered, where silence hangs heavy over vast landscapes of grass, stone, and ice. The Earth 200 years ago was not empty, but neither was it crowded. Small groups of humans, our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, moved quietly through the valleys of Africa and beyond, their fires glowing faintly against the night. And in other places, parallel lives were being lived by another kind of human. Neanderthals, broad-chested and powerful, carving out their survival in the frigid wilderness of Ice Age Europe. These were not great nations. They were families, clans, fragile networks of perhaps 20, 40, maybe 60 people. Each band was bound together not by borders or kings, but by necessity: food, shelter, fire. And in a world where each resource was scarce, where winter could wither the land into silence, the existence of another group nearby was not simply a curiosity, it was a threat. Imagine the scene: a cluster of hunters following the tracks of deer across the snow. They move quietly, spears balanced in their hands, their breath pluming in the cold. The tracks lead them to a grove where shadows move, but the silhouettes they find are not of deer, they are people, another band. Spears already raised. In that instant, the hunt becomes something else. The prey is no longer animal, but human. Archaeology preserves fragments of these encounters, scattered bones showing signs of healed fractures, as if men had struck each other with clubs or stones. Caves where multiple skeletons reveal violent deaths, skulls fractured in ways that suggest ambush rather than accident. Anthropologists debate the meaning of these signs, but perhaps it is not so difficult to imagine. When survival depended on a single hunting ground, the sudden presence of rivals could mean starvation for your children. To fight was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. And yet, the violence was not constant. These groups were small, they moved, they avoided each other when they could. But sooner or later, territories overlapped. A water source shared, a cave contested, a herd of animals pursued by two bands at once. It was here, in these collisions, that the first sparks of tribal conflict flared. Think of it this way. Today we worry about borders drawn on maps, lines that decide where one nation ends and another begins. But for early humans, there were no lines, only the invisible geography of survival. A cave high in the limestone cliffs, warm in winter, dry in rain, a stream that did not freeze, a grove where fruit ripened each season. These were the fortresses and kingdoms of the prehistoric world, and when one group held them, another group was denied. Conflict was the language that settled who would stay and who would go. The Neanderthals, especially, embodied this reality. Their bodies were thick with power, their bones dense and strong, their muscles built for close combat. A Neanderthal male could crush an opponent's hand with ease, drive a wooden spear into the side of a mammoth, or wrestle prey to the ground in brutal efficiency. To confront them was to face not only a rival tribe but a rival species, one whose strength dwarfed that of Homo sapiens. And yet, sapiens were not weak. Our advantage lay elsewhere. Where the Neanderthal's body was fortress-like, ours was built for endurance, for cooperation, for thought. A group of sapiens could run down prey across endless miles, could plan an ambush, could outmaneuver through strategy what they could not outmatch in strength. This tension, the brute power of one species and the cunning adaptability of another, was a formula for conflict that may have lasted millennia. Picture it in a more intimate frame. You are standing barefoot in a riverbed, stone spear in hand. You hear the splash of water upstream. At first you think it is a deer, but the shapes emerging are human, broad-shouldered, unfamiliar, strangers to your tongue. They look at you, and you at them, each frozen in the knowledge that this river cannot belong to both. The silence stretches. Then the first rock is lifted, the first shout rises into the cold air. What follows is not battle as we think of it, but chaos, flashes of stone and wood, bodies colliding, screams echoing against stone. When it ends, the river runs red, and those who remain know the ground has been claimed. Archaeologists remind us to tread carefully here. The evidence is fragmentary. A crushed skull does not automatically mean murder. A broken rib could be the mark of a fall, not a spear. And yet, patterns emerge too consistently to ignore. Too many clustered injuries, too many instances of mass death in caves where no predator explains the violence. The suggestion is clear. Conflict was not rare. It was woven into survival itself. And still, perhaps, we should not imagine it as endless war in the way modern minds conceive of it. These were not campaigns stretching across continents. They were eruptions, sudden, sharp, decisive, a raid at night. An ambush at a river crossing, the taking of a cave, short bursts of violence that echoed long in memory. For the survivors, each scar was a warning, each burial a reminder. What if, then, this was the cradle of our warrior instinct? Not glory, not conquest, but the cold necessity of staying alive. When we look back through the lens of anthropology, through DNA and fossilized bone, we see not only the survival of the fittest, but the survival of the fiercest. Those who hesitated, who yielded, may not have passed their lineage forward. And so, war was not only survival, it was inheritance. Consider also the landscape itself. Climate shifts made the world unstable. Ice advanced and retreated. Forests gave way to tundra. Animals vanished from hunting grounds. A group that once thrived in abundance might, within a generation, face scarcity. And when scarcity came, it drove movement. Bands of humans wandered into each other's paths, not out of malice but out of hunger. The earth itself set the stage for conflict, and humans simply played their roles. And what of the night, when the fires burned low and shadows moved just beyond the edge of vision? The fear of ambush was constant. To sleep was to risk surprise. Guards must have kept watch, eyes straining against darkness, ears tuned for the crack of a branch, the distant echo of footsteps. In such moments, war was not a distant possibility. It was the unspoken presence in every silence. We might even imagine that conflict was not only physical but psychological. Displays of strength, shouting across valleys, leaving markings near waterholes. Perhaps these were the first gestures of intimidation, attempts to avoid battle through fear. The bones tell us of clashes, yes, but the silences in the archaeological record suggest another truth. Much of the war may have been fought in threats, warnings, and shows of force. And yet, when those warnings failed, violence followed. This is the paradox of the first tribal conflicts. They were not wars of ambition, but wars of necessity. They were not fought to expand empires, but to hold onto a cave, a stream, a patch of land where berries grew. They were not written in words, but in the shattered bones left behind. So, when we speak of the birth of tribal conflict, we are speaking of more than battles. We are speaking of the forging of human identity itself. To be human, perhaps, was to be both nurturer and warrior, to cradle a child in one moment and to wield a club in the next. Survival demanded nothing less. And yet, this birth of conflict was only the beginning. For once tools became weapons, once survival sharpened into violence, something irreversible had been set in motion. The first sparks of war were struck, and what followed, across generations, would only grow sharper, deadlier, more deliberate. To understand that shift, we must look more closely at the very tools these early humans carried. Because in the prehistoric world, every tool was more than it seemed. A stone was not only for cutting meat, it could crush a skull. A spear was not only for hunting, it was for killing one's rival. From necessity came invention, and from invention came weaponry. And that brings us to the next stage of our journey, the rise of the first weapons. Picture the simplest object in the hands of an early human, a branch snapped from a tree. At first glance, it is nothing more than wood, useful for poking at the fire or knocking fruit from a branch. But now imagine that same branch sharpened at one end, hardened by flame until its fibers darken and strengthen. Suddenly, it is no longer just a stick, it is a spear, capable of piercing hide, striking flesh, ending life. This is the moment when survival tools crossed an invisible threshold. Every object carried by our ancestors could shift from utility to weapon in the span of a heartbeat. A stone used to butcher a carcass could, in anger, be hurled at the head of a rival. A digging stick for roots could be swung like a club. Even fire itself, the most precious discovery of early humans, could be turned outward, used to drive predators from caves or to flush enemies from hiding. Archaeological evidence reveals that some of the earliest spears discovered date back nearly 400 years, long before Homo sapiens spread widely across the continents. The famous Schöningen spears of Germany, crafted from spruce with tips carefully shaped and fire-hardened, speak of deliberate engineering. These were not crude branches, they were balanced, weighted, and honed to function in both hunting and perhaps combat. When held in the hands of Neanderthals or early sapiens, they were as deadly in close quarters as any sword would be thousands of years later. And yet, we must pause to consider the duality of these implements. When an early human shaped a stone flake with delicate strikes, their intent may have been to carve meat from bone or to strip bark from a tree. But once created, that flake carried within it a darker possibility. It could slice skin, it could draw blood. Perhaps this was the first truth of human technology, that it always contained both creation and destruction. Imagine for a moment that you are seated in the glow of firelight. Beside you lies a collection of tools, a sharp-edged stone, a heavy hammer rock, a spear resting against the wall of the cave. To you, they are essential for tomorrow's hunt. But then, in the dark outside, you hear movement. Another band approaches. Suddenly, those same objects are transformed. The hammer stone is now a weapon to strike with. The spear is raised not against a deer but against a rival's chest. The boundary between tool and weapon collapses in the instant danger appears. It is here that speculation becomes irresistible. Could it be that the very birth of weapons was not a separate invention at all, but simply the recognition of what tools already were? That humans did not invent war implements, but discovered the violent potential hidden in every object they carried. Perhaps the first weapon was not shaped by intent but by circumstance. The club, in particular, must have been one of the earliest. A simple length of wood, weighted at one end, swung with force against skull or limb. No refinement was required, and yet the results were devastating. Skulls from early sites show signs of blunt force trauma, impacts that suggest more than accident. To stand at the receiving end of such a strike was to know instantly that survival hinged on who held the heavier branch, the firmer grip, the stronger arm. But the spear was different. It was not simply a tool repurposed. It was refinement, intention. Fire-hardened wood meant foresight, planning, the deliberate shaping of nature to serve human purpose. It was the first step toward technology as we now understand it. And once spears existed, their potential as weapons must have been obvious. They could be thrust at an enemy with explosive power, used to keep distance in a fight, or even hurled through the air in a crude form of ranged attack. Consider also the psychological effect of weapons. To hold a spear is to hold authority. To walk into a clearing carrying sharpened stones at your belt is to display not only readiness but warning. Even before a blow is struck, the mere presence of these objects transforms human interaction. The first weapons may not only have killed, they may have intimidated, altered negotiations, dictated who held dominance in a meeting between rival groups. And then there is fire, the greatest of human discoveries, the light in the dark, the warmth in the cold, the guardian against predators. But in conflict, it could become a terror. A torch hurled into a shelter of hides, a blaze set at the mouth of a cave, a ring of flame used to trap or to drive. Fire was more than weapon, it was strategy, the earliest form of psychological warfare. Imagine being inside a cave, the stone walls secure around you, when the entrance begins to glow red and smoke billows inward. Your heart would race not against an enemy's club, but against the suffocating certainty of flame. And so, each weapon carried not just physical danger, but also symbolism. A club was strength made visible. A spear was foresight sharpened to a point. Fire was fear itself, wielded by human hands. From these beginnings, a pattern emerges. The history of humanity has always been a history of dual-use tools. The knife that carves food can also carve flesh. The bow that hunts deer can also hunt men. Even today, our greatest technologies, whether engines, chemicals, or circuits, carry both sides of the coin. The roots of that duality stretch back into the dim glow of prehistoric fires, when the first weapons blurred into existence almost by accident. And yet, there is another layer to consider. Perhaps weapons were not merely instruments of destruction, but also catalysts for social change. To wield a weapon effectively required cooperation. A hunt with spears demanded coordination, timing, the knowledge of where each person would strike. The same may have been true in conflict with other groups. Violence required not only courage but organization. Could it be that weapons, in their grim efficiency, were also teachers of unity, that they forged bonds as much as they broke them? Think of a small group gathered around their fire after an ambush. They clean blood from stone blades, mend spear shafts with sinew, recount each blow struck. In those retellings, identity is strengthened. The group remembers who stood firm, who faltered, who struck the decisive strike. Weapons did not only end lives, they carved memory, legend, perhaps even the first glimmers of status. And here, another speculation arises. Did the first warriors emerge not because they sought glory, but because they survived more battles than others? Perhaps a man scarred from many fights who returned again and again with his spear intact became a figure of authority, his survival itself a symbol of leadership. If so, then the first weapons also forged the first hierarchies. The archaeological record whispers of this possibility. Burials from later prehistory sometimes include weapons laid beside the dead. Perhaps this tradition stretches back further than we know, to times when a spear buried with a body marked not just a tool lost, but a warrior remembered. But what remains most striking is how universal the principle seems. Across Africa, Europe, and Asia, wherever humans roamed, they carried tools that could become weapons. Clubs, stones, spears, fire. The designs varied little because the necessities varied little. Survival shaped invention, and invention shaped conflict. So let us imagine again a narrow valley, two groups meeting unexpectedly, both weary from the hunt. Spears are lowered, not in greeting but in readiness. Stones are picked up from the ground, knuckles tighten around wood. The air is heavy with the possibility of violence, the recognition that every tool held in every hand can, in an instant, be turned against another human. This is not yet organized war, but it is its seed. Weapons had been born, not as separate inventions, but as shadows of survival. They would grow sharper, more refined, more specialized with each generation. And with them, conflict would grow sharper too. But before we can follow that story forward, before we watch these weapons evolve into the instruments of war that would one day shape entire species, we must first ask, what happens when a rival is not merely another tribe, but another kind of human altogether? Because the birth of weapons set the stage for a conflict larger than any single cave, any single valley. It set the stage for the great struggle between sapiens and Neanderthals, the wars of brains against brawn. Step into Ice Age Europe. The air is sharp and thin, the forests dark with conifers, and snow crunches underfoot even in summer's shadow. Here lived a people unlike us, yet so close to us that their eyes might have looked familiar across the firelight. Neanderthals, stocky, powerful, adapted to the cold like no other human species. Their very bones tell the story, thicker, denser, with massive muscle attachments. A Neanderthal thigh bone could endure forces that would snap ours like kindling. Their chests were wide, their lungs vast, their limbs shorter and stronger, built to withstand frigid winds and the violent hunts of Ice Age beasts. And those bones, when unearthed, whisper of conflict. Fractured skulls with healing lines, ribs snapped and mended, teeth cracked from blunt impacts. Archaeologists compare these injuries to those of modern rodeo riders, men who wrestle massive animals in contests of danger. But Neanderthals did not step into arenas, they lived their lives in them. Each hunt against mammoths or bison, each clash with predators, carried the risk of shattered bone, and some of those breaks, some of those blows, were not accidents of the hunt. They were delivered by other humans. Consider one haunting detail. Neanderthal skeletons often show head and upper body trauma, the kind of injuries consistent with close combat. Clubs swung at skulls, spears driven at ribs. These were not distant arrows loosed across open fields. These were fights face to face, strength against strength, bone against stone. Imagine the scene. A small band of Neanderthals, broad-shouldered and scarred, encamped at the mouth of a cave. Their fire glows low as the night wind curls around the rocks. Suddenly, a shout, foreign voices, unfamiliar rhythms. The intruders are not animals. They are Homo sapiens, leaner, lighter, eyes scanning, weapons ready. What follows is chaos. A clash of bodies, spears thrust and clubs swung, shadows colliding in the glow of fire. The Neanderthals fight with terrifying power, but the sapiens fight with something else: coordination, speed, the cunning of ambush. To sapiens, encountering Neanderthals must have been like meeting giants. Their grip strength alone may have doubled ours, their muscles layered with explosive power. A single blow from a Neanderthal could end a life. To stand against them required more than bravery, it required strategy. And so perhaps the earliest wars between species were not contests of endurance but contests of difference. The Neanderthals, unmatched in physical force, confronted the sapiens, whose advantage lay in endurance, planning, and adaptability. One species was fortress, the other was flowing river, and between them lay the question: who would survive? The evidence is subtle, scattered, yet compelling. Take the famous Shanidar cave in Iraq. Among the remains of Neanderthals found there, many bore injuries that had healed long before death. These were communities that nursed their wounded, cared for their weak. Yet others show fatal blows, perhaps inflicted not by animals but by other humans. When archaeologists lift those bones into the light, they glimpse not only survival but struggle, evidence of raids, ambushes, confrontations in the depths of prehistory. We must tread carefully, though. It is easy to imagine vast battles, armies of sapiens and Neanderthals clashing in snowy valleys. But the reality was smaller, sharper, more intimate. Dozens, not thousands. A raid at dawn, a fight by a riverbank, a sudden ambush on a hunting path, and yet the consequences were enormous. For each tribe lost, each lineage extinguished, the balance of the species shifted. Speculation invites another possibility. Did sapiens and Neanderthals recognize each other as kin? When their eyes met across the firelight, did they see enemies or something disturbingly familiar? We know from genetic evidence that interbreeding occurred. Children of mixed blood lived and grew, carrying traces of both species. But alongside those unions, there must have been violence. For every child born of joining, another must have fallen to the spear. Love and war braided together, inseparable in the shadows of prehistory. Picture again the clash of these two species. The Neanderthal steps forward, muscles taut, a wooden spear gripped in his massive hand. His brow ridges cast shadows over eyes narrowed in rage. Across from him, a sapiens hunter raises his own weapon, leaner arms trembling not with weakness but with calculation. He knows he cannot match the blow for blow, but he does not need to. His tribe has circled wide, hidden in the trees, ready to strike from all sides. When the Neanderthal lunges, the trap is sprung. Stones rain from above, spears jab from flanks. The giant falls not to one man's strength, but to the collective cunning of many. The war between sapiens and Neanderthals, if we can call it that, was not one campaign but thousands of moments like this. And the bones, scattered across caves and valleys, record the echoes of those moments. Archaeology shows us Neanderthals with healed skull fractures, cracked ribs, and crushed limbs. The injuries tell a story of violence endured and survived, but they also tell of a world where combat was expected, where to live was to fight. In this sense, Neanderthals were not simply victims of conflict, they were masters of it, shaped by it, defined by it. And yet, sapiens endured. Fragile in comparison, yes, but relentless. We ran farther, cooperated in greater numbers, shared knowledge across groups. Our brains, slightly smaller in raw volume but tuned differently, found advantage in communication, in strategy, in the subtleties of cooperation. Against Neanderthals, brute force alone was not enough. The wars between our species may have been decided not in the single clash of two warriors, but in the long patience of tribes planning, ambushing, retreating, and returning again. Speculation suggests something haunting. Perhaps sapiens could never have survived without conflict against Neanderthals. Facing such formidable rivals may have sharpened us, forcing innovation, driving us to think not only about tools but about tactics. Every raid survived, every ambush executed, every victory against stronger foes may have carved into our species the instinct for strategy that defines warfare even now. And so, the Neanderthal wars were more than survival struggles. They were crucibles. They shaped us. They taught us that strength alone does not guarantee survival, that cunning can overcome force, that numbers, coordination, and planning can topple even the mightiest. But the story does not end with this grim balance, because as we move deeper into this saga, a question arises. What happens when war ceases to be mere clash of power and becomes instead a contest of minds? The next stage in our journey will explore that very transformation, the battle not only of bodies, but of brains. Imagine two hunters standing on opposite ends of the same valley. One is a Neanderthal, his chest broad, his arms thick with muscle. In his hand, a heavy spear rests, more like a lance than a projectile, designed to be thrust into flesh at close range. His body is built for such combat, every fiber honed by a lifetime of physical survival. Across from him, hidden in the shadows of a thicket, is a Homo sapiens. His frame is lighter, his limbs longer, his breath steady from endurance hunting. In his hand is a similar spear, but his advantage is not in the weapon, it is in the plan. This, perhaps, was the defining difference between the two species. Neanderthals were fortresses of flesh and bone, their power unmatched, their grip strong enough to crush objects we would struggle to bend. Yet sapiens carried something invisible but equally lethal: strategy. Where the Neanderthal excelled in direct combat, sapiens learned to avoid directness altogether. Archaeology hints at this through patterns of weapon use. The Schöningen spears, designed by Neanderthals, were heavy thrusting tools. They required the hunter to be dangerously close to prey or enemy. Sapiens, by contrast, adapted toward lighter projectiles, tools that could be thrown, tools that could strike from a distance. This distinction may have echoed in conflict. Where Neanderthals charged headlong, sapiens encircled. Where Neanderthals struck with force, sapiens struck with cunning. Picture a dawn raid. A Neanderthal band slumbers in their cave, their fires burned to embers. Outside, a group of sapiens moves silently, their steps rehearsed, their roles decided. One blocks the entrance with firebrands, another circles to the higher ground, others wait with stones ready to be hurled. When the attack begins, it is not a contest of strength, it is a choreography of timing. Confusion spreads, the stronger foes pushed into chaos. In minutes, the battle is over, and the cave belongs to the weaker in body but sharper in plan. Perhaps this is how sapiens survived encounters that, on paper, should have been hopeless. Numbers mattered too. Neanderthal groups seem to have been smaller, often under 30 individuals. Sapiens bands, interconnected through broader social networks, could unite in larger numbers. In battle, a difference of even 10 fighters could shift the balance. And sapiens used this advantage well, coordinating ambushes, surrounding enemies, overwhelming them not with single strikes but with waves of coordinated assault. There is also the question of communication. Neanderthals had large brains, even slightly larger than ours, but sapiens may have had a crucial advantage in symbolic thought and language. The ability to whisper plans, to signal silently with gestures, to deceive, to feint, these were weapons as sharp as stone. Imagine a Neanderthal advancing into battle, spear ready, unaware that the silence in the forest is not emptiness, but the breath of hidden sapiens waiting for the signal. A bird call, a stone clack, a sudden shout, and the trap springs shut. Speculation invites us to see these encounters as the first laboratories of human strategy. Ambush, deception, coordinated attack, these were not yet written in manuals of war, but they lived in the instincts of our ancestors. Every raid refined them, every victory reinforced them, every loss taught a lesson. It is possible that the very foundations of military thought, the feint, the flank, the trap, were forged in these forgotten skirmishes. But the cost was staggering. Archaeological remains tell us of Neanderthals with spear points embedded in bone. Some survived their wounds, the tips still lodged within their ribs, healing crookedly. Others died, their bodies abandoned or buried in shallow graves. Sapiens too carried scars, fractures healed unevenly, skulls cracked by blunt impacts. Conflict spared no one. But in the long measure of millennia, sapiens endured, and Neanderthals began to vanish. It is tempting to see this as destiny, that the clever would inevitably outlast the strong. But perhaps it was not so simple. Strength has its own cunning. Neanderthals hunted mammoths, rhinos, and bears with courage and precision. They thrived in Europe for over 300 years, long before sapiens set foot there. Their strategies, though different, were effective. What changed was the encounter itself, the collision of two ways of being human. Imagine a frozen steppe. The Neanderthal band moves across the snow, shoulders hunched against the wind, their prey in sight. But from the ridgeline above, sapiens wait. They have studied the herd's path, anticipated where the hunt would lead. As the Neanderthals close in, stones rain from the ridge, startling the animals, scattering the hunt, sowing confusion. The sapiens rush in, not with greater force, but with disruption. The prey flees, the Neanderthals retreat bloodied and empty-handed. Strength falters before foresight. Could it be that this was the true war? Not endless battles to the death, but contests over hunts, over resources, over access to food. And in those contests, the brain's edge proved decisive. The balance between brains and brawn was not absolute. Sometimes Neanderthals triumphed. Their raw power, their close quarters ferocity, their resilience in the cold made them terrifying foes. But sapiens learned from defeat, adjusted tactics, returned with new plans. Over generations, the lessons accumulated. Where the Neanderthal relied on what worked before, sapiens thrived on innovation. And so, intelligence became its own weapon, not just in battle, but in preparation. Sapiens made alliances across groups, shared information about hunting grounds, spread innovations through networks stretching hundreds of miles. Neanderthals, more isolated, did not have this web of connection. When sapiens struck, they struck not as one small band, but as part of a broader system of knowledge and support. This, then, was the battle of brains versus brawn, a slow, grinding contest where each encounter mattered, where every advantage was tested, where the future of two species hung in the balance. And while Neanderthals remain in our DNA, traces of their blood mixed into ours, their bodies vanished from the earth. The wars between sapiens and Neanderthals remind us of a haunting truth. Survival does not always favor the strongest, but the most adaptable. Brains outlasted brawn, not because one was superior in essence, but because the world rewarded foresight, cooperation, and cunning. And yet, if brains triumphed in the end, what forms of conflict did this victory set in motion? For once the mind became the sharpest weapon, war itself would change forever. To understand how, we must turn to the shadows of caves, where evidence of sudden raids and ambushes lies buried in stone. Step with me into the darkness of a cave, deep in prehistory. The air is still, heavy with the scent of ash long extinguished. On the ground lie bones, scattered, fractured, some bearing the unmistakable marks of violence, not the teeth of predators, not the quiet decay of time. These bones tell another story, one of sudden assault, of lives ended not by hunger or storm, but by human hands. Archaeological sites across Europe and the Near East preserve these chilling records. In certain caves, entire groups are found, their remains clustered together as though death came all at once, skulls with caved-in fractures. Children among the fallen. The arrangement suggests not accident, not natural disaster, but something deliberate, raids. Unlike the battlefields of later history, there was no open ground where armies lined up in ranks. Prehistoric war was not fought in daylight under banners. It erupted without warning, a strike in the night, a sudden clash at the mouth of a shelter. To call it war may even be misleading. These were ambushes, eruptions of violence as swift as they were decisive. Imagine the moment. A band sleeps in the dim glow of firelight. Outside, in the cold silence, another group creeps closer. Spears gripped tight, stones ready. A child stirs in the cave, but before the alarm can rise, the first intruders are already inside. A shout, a blow, chaos exploding in the shadows. In minutes, it is over. The survivors flee into the night. The victors claim the fire, the shelter, the food. Why such brutality? The reasons are as old as hunger. A cave meant warmth in winter, a dry place to sleep, safety from predators. A river bend meant water that would not run dry. A store of meat could mean the difference between starvation and survival. And sometimes, raids were not only for resources, but for people. Mates taken, children absorbed into rival groups. Violence and survival were intertwined, inseparable threads in the prehistoric fabric. The evidence is not confined to bones. Charred layers in caves suggest fires deliberately set, perhaps to drive rivals out or to suffocate them within. Burned tools, collapsed structures, scorched stone all hint at deliberate destruction. It is difficult to imagine these acts as anything other than calculated raids, early experiments in the use of terror. Think of how these ambushes must have shaped daily life. To venture into the open was to risk encounter. To sleep was to risk surprise. Guards may have been posted, eyes straining into the night, ears alert for the smallest sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of grass. Perhaps the need for constant vigilance carved itself into our very biology, into the light sleep and sudden waking that still jolt us in darkness. Speculation carries us further. Perhaps raids were not always intended to annihilate. Sometimes, the goal may have been intimidation, a show of force to warn rivals away from a hunting ground. A few deaths, a fire set, a message left in the form of destruction. In this way, violence became not only physical but psychological, teaching enemies to fear even the possibility of attack. And yet, when we examine the bones, we see that these raids did not discriminate. Children, elders, women, and men alike fell to sudden violence. This was not ritualized combat between champions, but survival stripped of mercy. A raid was total, because in the unforgiving balance of prehistory, leaving survivors meant leaving future enemies. Picture the aftermath of such an ambush. The victors, bloodied and exhausted, gather what they can meet, hides, tools, perhaps captives, and vanish before dawn. The cave is silent again, but its floor is littered with bodies, its walls scorched with smoke. Centuries later, archaeologists will find these remains and piece together the story, not through words, but through scars. Some of the most haunting evidence comes from caves like El Cidrón in Spain, where Neanderthal bones show not only violent fractures but signs of cannibalism, flesh stripped, marrow extracted. Was this desperation in famine, or was it also a strategy of erasure, consuming enemies to deny them even the dignity of burial? We cannot know for certain, but the possibility is chilling. This, then, was the reality of raids and ambushes. There was no battlefield, no army, no treaty. There was only sudden, overwhelming violence, followed by silence. And yet, perhaps these moments carried something more than terror. They may have been crucibles of memory. Survivors remembered the raids, passed on warnings in story and gesture. Do not trust those who come from the east. Watch the ridge at night. In this way, violence became part of culture, shaping identity, shaping fear, shaping how groups defined themselves against one another. It is possible that raids also forged the earliest forms of alliance. If one band was attacked, another nearby might offer support in return for mutual protection. Networks of kinship may have grown not only through marriage or trade, but through shared defense. Violence fractured, but it also bound, creating the first threads of collective identity beyond the family. Let us imagine one such night. The cave is quiet, fire glowing low. A young boy wakes to the sound of footsteps, a shadow at the entrance. In moments, shouts echo, spears clash, stone blades glint in firelight. He runs deeper into the darkness, pressed against the cold wall, heart pounding. He survives, though most of his kin do not. Years later, as a man, he tells the story to his children: beware the silence of night, beware the eyes that watch from the forest. And in this way, raids live on not only in bones, but in memory, passed across generations. Perhaps this is why sudden violence has always haunted us more deeply than open battle. Even now, in our stories and fears, ambush carries a particular terror, the sense of being attacked without warning, of safety shattered in an instant. That fear was born long before cities, long before nations. It was born in caves, in shadows, in the raids that carved prehistory into memory. And yet, as terrifying as these ambushes were, they were only the beginning. For in time, humans learned that violence could be more than sudden death. It could be spectacle, strategy, even message. And to understand that transformation, we must look not only at raids, but at the first terror tactics. Picture yourself standing at the mouth of a cave, the night stretched wide and silent before you. Behind you, your kin huddle near the dim glow of a fire, trusting that stone walls will guard them until dawn. Then, faintly at first, the scent of smoke sharpens on the air. A crackling sound drifts closer. The fire is not your own, it is theirs. Flames bloom suddenly at the entrance, choking the air with ash, swallowing the darkness with red light. Panic ripples through the group. The cave, once sanctuary, becomes a trap. This may have been one of the earliest terror tactics in human history. Fire turned not only against beasts or forests, but against each other. Archaeological traces, charred cave floors, layers of soot buried deep in prehistory suggest that some fires were no accident. Perhaps they were kindled deliberately to smoke rivals from their shelters, to force them into the open where spears waited. It was more than killing. It was the mastery of fear. To wield fire against enemies was to remind them of their own fragility, to turn the very element they relied upon for survival into a weapon of destruction. The cave dwellers who fled such flames carried scars deeper than burns. They carried memory, and memory, in the prehistoric world, was as potent as any weapon. Ambushes at night served a similar purpose. Darkness has always been our oldest fear, the place where predators stalked unseen. To strike in that darkness was to amplify terror beyond the violence itself. A raid in daylight ended swiftly, but an ambush at night, shadows darting between flickering flames, screams echoing in the void, created confusion that lingered long after the battle ended. Survivors remembered the fear more than the blows. Speculation leads us further still. Perhaps these early acts were the first experiments in psychological warfare. Not war as annihilation, but war as message. To set fire at the mouth of a cave was to declare, "Nowhere is safe." To ambush at night was to say, "We can come when you least expect it." These were not random acts of violence, but performances of power. Imagine the impact on children who survived such terror. Their earliest memories shaped by the sight of flames consuming their shelter, or by the sudden shrieks of kin dragged into the night. Those children grew into adults who carried vigilance in their bones. They built their lives around the fear that what happened once could happen again. And in this way, terror was not only a tactic, it was inheritance. Archaeology whispers clues to this inheritance. In some sites, caves appear abandoned abruptly, as though entire groups fled never to return. Tools and ornaments left behind, bones scattered without burial, fires extinguished mid-use. These ghostly remains suggest not famine, not disease, but sudden violence, perhaps raids amplified by terror tactics that shattered the will to resist. And what of the fire itself? Fire was both lifeline and threat. To keep it burning was survival. To see it turned against you was devastation. We can imagine the psychological devastation of watching one's own element stolen, used as instrument of destruction. Fire could destroy food stores, blacken tools, collapse wooden shelters. Its light could blind in ambush, its smoke suffocate, its roar drown out the shouts of warning. To face fire was to face not only enemy hands, but the raw force of nature bent deliberately toward harm. This duality, the same flame that warmed also burned, that protected also destroyed, made fire the most terrifying of prehistoric weapons. Unlike a spear or stone, it was not confined to one strike. It spread, it consumed, it lingered. Even after the attackers were gone, the fire they set left scars that outlasted them. Speculative thought carries us further. Could these tactics have been ritualized, repeated until they became part of identity? Perhaps some groups became known not just for their strength but for their use of terror bands who struck at night, who carried torches as weapons, who left rivals trembling at the sight of smoke on the horizon. If so, then the earliest seeds of reputation and fear-based dominance had already taken root. Think of how quickly such reputations would spread in the small world of early humans. A single ambush, a single cave burned, retold across valleys and rivers, could cast an entire group as monsters in the minds of their neighbors. To be feared was to win battles without fighting. Terror became not just tactic, but strategy. And yet, perhaps we should not see these acts only as cruelty. They were survival. In a world where resources were scarce, fear itself became a resource. To frighten rivals away from water or hunting grounds meant fewer raids, fewer clashes. To terrify a group into abandoning a cave meant securing shelter without prolonged bloodshed. Terror, in this sense, was efficient. Brutal, yes, but efficient. Picture a tribe returning to their cave after days of hunting, only to find it blackened with ash, their stores destroyed, the smell of smoke lingering in the stones. They may not have lost lives that day, but they had lost something else, the assurance of safety. From that moment on, every flicker of fire in the distance would carry new meaning. Every rustle in the dark might be an enemy waiting to strike. Terror stretched beyond the act itself, living on in anticipation, in dread. Perhaps that is why these tactics endure even now, echoed in the strategies of later civilizations. Long before sieges, before armies, before nations, humans discovered that war could be fought not only with blows, but with fear. And fear, once planted, could grow stronger than any weapon. And so, the first terror tactics mark a turning point. Violence became more than survival, it became communication. It sent messages through smoke and fire, through screams in the night, through bones left unburied. It declared not just victory, but dominance. It carved into memory the knowledge that enemies were not only stronger or faster, they could be more ruthless. But this raises a deeper question. If fear itself became a weapon, how far would early humans go to wield it? To answer, we must step into darker evidence still, the bones of the dead, stripped not only of life but of flesh. The bones speak in silence. When archaeologists unearth them, what they see is not merely fracture or decay, but the unmistakable patterns of human hands at work. Long bones split lengthwise, marrow extracted, skulls broken open with deliberate strikes, scrape marks fine and precise, etched along the surface where flesh was stripped away. These are not the marks of predators. They are the marks of people, cutting people. Cannibalism, a word that chills even now, yet in prehistory it was not always ritual, nor madness. Sometimes it was survival. Sites across Europe, Moula Guerci in France, El Cidrón in Spain, reveal evidence of this grim necessity. At Mula Guerci, the remains of 6 Neanderthals were discovered, bones shattered and scraped in ways identical to the butchery of deer found at the same site. At El Cedron, the bones of 12 Neanderthals, including children, bore cut marks showing flesh removed, marrow sucked dry. The evidence leaves little room for doubt. These were not accidents of scavenging, they were deliberate. Imagine the desperation of such a moment. Winter grips the valley, herds migrate south, food grows scarce, days stretch into weeks without meat. A child cries with hunger, an elder collapses. The fire flickers low, and eyes turn toward the bodies of the dead. Flesh still clings to bone. In the silence of starvation, one truth presses against all others: to eat or to die. Perhaps the first act was hesitant. A knife edge pressed against skin, not of prey, but of kin. The cut is made, the strip of flesh taken. Hunger overrides revulsion. Once eaten, the taboo, if such a thing existed, breaks. Soon others join. Bones are cracked for marrow, fat roasted over fire. What once was family or rival becomes sustenance. But was it only necessity? Speculation suggests a darker possibility that cannibalism could also be strategy. To consume the body of an enemy was to erase them completely. Not only were they killed, they were unmade, transformed into nourishment for their killers. In this way, violence extended beyond death, sending a message carved not in wounds but in absence. Consider the psychological impact on survivors. To discover a cave where kin had not only been slaughtered but consumed would have been terror beyond terror. It declared not only power but ruthlessness absolute. It said, "We will not only defeat you, we will feed on you." Could this have been one of the earliest forms of deterrence, a message meant to frighten rivals into retreat without a fight? The archaeological record leaves fragments, but patterns emerge. At El Cedron, the bones showed not signs of ceremonial placement, but of processing for food defleshing, disarticulation, marrow extraction. This was not ritual sacrifice. It was survival calculus, calories measured against morality, hunger outweighing horror. And yet, in the harsh arithmetic of Ice Age existence, perhaps morality as we know it was not part of the equation at all. When winter raged and bellies ached, when no deer could be found and no roots dug from the frozen ground, the dead enemy or kin became simply another resource. Flesh was meat, bone was marrow. In that moment, survival did not ask permission. Still, we should not imagine cannibalism as common practice. It was a choice made under duress, a last resort in times of famine or siege. But when it was chosen, its effects rippled far beyond the meal itself. Those who partook survived when others starved. Their children lived to pass on genes, knowledge, and memory. Survival is indifferent to revulsion. And so, cannibalism may have quietly shaped the story of who endured. Imagine again the scene, this time from the perspective of the eater. Your hands tremble as you hold a bone split open, the marrow glistening inside. You raise it to your lips, and for an instant, you see the face of the one it belonged to. Perhaps you whisper a name, perhaps not. Hunger drowns hesitation. The marrow is sweet, rich in fat. For a moment, warmth returns to your body. For a moment, you live. Speculation suggests another dimension: cannibalism as initiation. Perhaps in some groups, consuming the flesh of the dead was not merely tolerated, but transformed into ritual, an act of grim unity, binding survivors together through shared transgression. To eat of the same body was to become one body. Could it be that some early tribes saw in this act not only horror, but communion? The bones cannot tell us feelings. They record only action, but action is enough to haunt us. What we can say is this: cannibalism in prehistory was not solely madness, not solely cruelty. It was, at times, a survival strategy. A way to endure famine, a way to erase rivals, perhaps even a way to claim power through fear. And in that realization lies a sobering truth. War in prehistory was not fought only with clubs and spears. It was fought with hunger, with terror, with the very bodies of the fallen. Violence was not only about killing, it was about what came after. But if cannibalism could be strategy, then it raises another question. Was it also message? Did the stripping of flesh and breaking of bone serve not only to nourish, but to warn? To answer, we must step further into speculation, into the realm of violence as communication, into the message carried by cannibalism itself. Consider the silence after a raid. Smoke lingers at the cave mouth, bodies lie scattered in shadow, and the victors withdraw into the night. Yet sometimes, what they left behind was not absence, but something more deliberate: bones split, flesh carved, marrow sucked clean. These were not only acts of survival, they were messages. To eat an enemy was to erase them utterly. Death alone might silence their voice, but consumption stripped away even the body, leaving nothing but fragments of bone. In the prehistoric imagination, where burial and memory were already emerging as ways to honor the dead, to be denied a body meant to be denied remembrance. Cannibalism was annihilation taken to its furthest edge. Perhaps, then, it was more than hunger. Perhaps it was warning. Imagine stumbling upon a site where your kin had been killed. You step cautiously into the dark, the stench of smoke still sharp. But what you find is worse than death. Bones gnawed and broken, skulls shattered, ribs split apart. The horror is not only in the violence, but in the certainty of its intent. This was done to frighten you, to tell you that your enemies will not only kill you, they will devour you. In this way, cannibalism became a form of psychological warfare, a signal that radiated across valleys and generations. To hear whispers that a rival tribe ate their enemies would change how you faced them. Fear grew before battle even began. Archaeological evidence hints at this dual role. At El Cedron, bones of Neanderthals were not merely butchered but left scattered without burial. If survival had been the only goal, the remains might have been disposed of quietly. But their display left visible, stripped, suggests something else: intimidation, perhaps even ritualized warning. Speculation carries us further. Could cannibalism have been staged deliberately, not just for food but as a message to those who would later discover the site? Fire blackening the cave walls, bones split and abandoned, the silence of deliberate desecration. If so, then the first acts of warfare as theater were already alive. Violence was no longer just about victory, it was about sending a message that echoed in memory long after the act itself. Think of how stories would travel. A child who survived such terror might one day tell their own children, "Do not go near the Valley of Ash. There, people eat people." Fear became portable, moving faster than raids, shaping landscapes through rumor alone. Cannibalism, then, was not only an act of violence but an amplifier of reputation. This echoes a larger truth about humanity. Long before writing, before monuments, our ancestors communicated power through symbols of violence. A spear thrust into the earth, a skull cracked and displayed, a body consumed. Each act said something beyond the act itself. It was language, carved in bone and blood. Consider also the possibility of hierarchy within these acts. Perhaps not all members of a tribe took part in eating an enemy. Perhaps it was reserved for warriors, or leaders, or shamans who carried authority in death as well as life. To consume was to claim power, to absorb not only flesh but essence. And so, cannibalism became more than sustenance, it became a statement of dominance. Speculation deepens further. Could it be that the horror we feel at the thought of cannibalism is itself part of the inheritance of these ancient messages? That our revulsion is not merely cultural, but ancestral, born from the fear instilled in those who first saw kin consumed by others? If so, then the memory of cannibalism survives not just in bones, but in instinct. Imagine again the scene of communication through terror. A tribe returns to a cave, expecting to bury their dead. Instead, they find desecration. The message is clear. We own even your flesh. We will deny you rest. What does a survivor do with such a truth? They carry it. They repeat it. They teach it. Violence becomes lesson, memory, warning. The archaeological record cannot prove intention, but it gives us patterns. Cut marks, bone breakage, selective consumption of fatty parts like marrow and brain. The same techniques applied to deer and bison appear on human remains. Survival explains part of it, but the consistency across sites suggests something more. Cannibalism was not aberration, but option, chosen repeatedly when conditions aligned. And when chosen, it left messages as potent as the violence itself. Let us imagine a final layer. What if the consumption of enemies also functioned as deterrent against revenge? To kill leaves mourners. To bury leaves graves. But to consume leaves nothing but fragments. How does one avenge a body that has been erased? Perhaps this was the unspoken logic. Deny the enemy not only life, but legacy. And so, the message of violence was carved in absence. Empty graves, bones stripped bare, stories whispered in fear. It was a message that said, we are not bound by mercy. We are not bound by the limits of death. We will unmake you entirely. This, then, was the dark genius of prehistoric warfare. The recognition that violence could echo beyond the moment, shaping minds, shaping memory, shaping choices yet to be made. But if cannibalism was message, then what other messages did early humans leave in the bones of their rivals? To answer, we must look at the body itself, not only consumed, but crushed, broken, wielded as both weapon and warning. In the silence of ancient caves, the bones tell us their secrets. Among them, skulls cracked open not by accident, but by the force of deliberate blows. The fractures are clean, decisive, angled in ways that reveal intent. These were not the results of stumbling falls or the careless slip of a stone. They are the aftermath of clubs swung with precision, of fists gripping rocks with murderous purpose. Archaeological records across Europe and Africa reveal skulls shattered by blunt force trauma. The pattern is striking. Fractures at the crown, blows to the temple, strikes delivered face to face. These injuries tell us something haunting about prehistoric warfare. It was not distant, not hidden. It was immediate, personal, intimate. Imagine the scene. Two figures locked in combat, breath steaming in the cold air. One raises a heavy branch, weighted at one end, and brings it down with explosive force. The sound of bone cracking echoes louder than the shouts, louder than the clash of stone. The other falls, skull fractured, body still. This is not war as we know it, with distance and technology insulating the killer. This is the kind of violence where death arrives in the press of hands, in the closeness of eyes staring into eyes. And yet, in this intimacy lies a deeper truth. The body itself became both weapon and target. Arms swung like clubs, teeth tore at flesh. Fingers gripped and crushed. Warfare in this age was not mediated by machinery, it was flesh against flesh, bone against bone. To fight meant to risk not only killing, but being killed in return, your own skull as fragile as the one you sought to break. Speculation invites us to imagine the ways tools blurred into weapons. A stone once used to crack nuts becomes a hammer against skulls. A femur of a hunted animal, strong and heavy, is lifted and swung as a club. Perhaps even the bones of enemies themselves, stripped of flesh, were turned against new victims. The line between tool, trophy, and weapon was as thin as survival itself. Archaeological evidence supports this eerie overlap. Some remains show repeated blows, as though attackers struck long after death was certain. Was this rage, or was it demonstration? To shatter a skull beyond repair may have carried meaning, declaring to survivors that resistance would not only be punished but obliterated. In this way, violence became not only act but symbol. Imagine a cave floor after such conflict. Broken skulls scattered, bones splintered, the marks of blunt strikes visible long after flesh decayed. To stumble upon such a sight would be to read a message in fragments. Here, enemies were not only killed, they were broken. The message was in the silence, in the fragments left as warning. The intimacy of face-to-face violence also shaped psychology. To kill in this way required direct confrontation, the sight of fear in an enemy's eyes, the sound of their breath as it ended. There was no distance to soften the act. Perhaps this left scars on the living as much as on the dead. Survivors carried not only wounds, but memories vivid and raw. In their dreams, they may have replayed the moments of impact, the sound of skulls cracking beneath their hands. Violence became part of their identity, woven into their very sense of what it meant to be human. But perhaps there was more. Could it be that skulls themselves became weapons even after death? Some anthropologists speculate that bones were used as tools and instruments of intimidation. A shattered skull, displayed at the entrance of a cave, would declare to all who approached, "This is what awaits you." The human body became both instrument of violence and artifact of warning. Think of how this transformed the landscape of prehistory. Valleys and caves marked not with walls or banners, but with bones. The skull of a rival set upon a rock, a fractured femur used as a club, a rib sharpened to a point. Even without writing, early humans communicated power through the remains of the body, through the visible reminders of violence inflicted. Speculation carries us to darker thoughts. Perhaps some groups wore skull fragments as ornaments or carried bones as talismans of victory. To hold a piece of a fallen rival was to hold proof of dominance. And to show it was to intimidate, to remind others of what had been done and what could be done again. But in the center of all this lies the face-to-face nature of early conflict. Unlike modern warfare, where distance and machinery depersonalize killing, prehistoric violence was visceral, embodied. To swing a club against a skull required not only strength, but proximity. Every blow was personal, every death intimate. Consider the resilience this demanded. To survive in such a world, humans hardened not only their bodies but their minds. They learned to see violence not as exception, but as possibility lurking in every encounter. Each meeting with strangers carried the potential for fracture, for death, for skulls broken and bones scattered. This intimacy also taught lessons that would echo through history. It taught that weapons were most effective when close, when direct. It taught that the human body was fragile despite its strength. It taught that dominance could be displayed in remains, in scars, in bones. These lessons shaped not only conflict, but culture, memory, and imagination. So when we speak of skulls and bones as weapons, we are not only describing blunt instruments of survival. We are describing symbols, messages, and memories. The cracked skull was both death and declaration. The splintered bone was both tool and terror. The body itself became a canvas upon which the language of violence was written. And yet, this opens another question. If bones could serve as weapons in life and warnings in death, could they also become something more, a ritual, a performance of fear that shaped identity as much as survival? To answer, we must step further into speculation, into the realm where violence became theater and bones became symbols of power. Imagine entering a valley at dusk. The air is still, the grasses whisper under a faint wind, and in the fading light, you notice something strange at the cave mouth ahead. Skulls. Human skulls, arranged on the rocks, hollow eyes staring outward. Some cracked, some charred, some perched deliberately, their presence undeniable. They are not there by accident. They are not prey remains discarded with the bones of animals. They are messages silent, chilling, deliberate. Speculation suggests that early humans did more than kill. They displayed. The body of an enemy was not only consumed or discarded, but positioned, transformed into symbol. Skulls, bones, even entire skeletons may have been used as warnings, proof of violence, monuments of fear. Archaeology provides whispers of this possibility. At certain sites, bones appear placed rather than scattered, collected rather than abandoned. In some burials, weapons are found alongside the dead, while in others, bones show deliberate arrangement outside of burial contexts. These patterns hint that bones were more than refuse, they were instruments of meaning. And where meaning is invoked, ritual is not far behind. Think of what it would mean to come upon such a display. You and your kin, weary from travel, seeking shelter, find instead a cave mouth marked with human remains. The message is unmistakable. This place is claimed. Enter, and you risk joining those who already stare hollow-eyed from the stone. Without a single word spoken, fear has been instilled. The ritual is complete. Perhaps some groups mastered this performance, turning it into part of their identity. To carry bones, to mount skulls, to paint remains with ochre or ash, these acts may have functioned as both intimidation and cohesion. To the outside world, they said, "We are to be feared." To the inside world, they said, "We are one people, bound by the violence we inflict together." Speculation deepens when we consider the role of ritual in prehistoric life. Death was not meaningless, it was acknowledged, even honored. But what if the deaths of enemies were acknowledged in a different way, not with respect, but with degradation? Their bones used as trophies, their skulls displayed as warnings. This inversion of ritual burial, turning reverence into terror, may have been one of the earliest forms of symbolic warfare. Picture a firelit ceremony after victory. Warriors return carrying skulls taken in conflict. The group gathers, the children watching as bones are placed in prominent positions. Songs may have been sung, gestures repeated, the remains consecrated not in honor but in fear. Such moments transformed violence into story, memory into myth. The skull was no longer simply bone, it was narrative, proof of survival, proof of dominance. This raises another possibility. Perhaps bones were not only displayed but carried. A femur strapped to the belt, a fragment of skull worn as pendant, a jawbone hung from the entrance of a shelter. Each fragment became a talisman, both protective and threatening. To display such remains was to broadcast a message: we have killed, and we will kill again. And in this, we glimpse the beginnings of something larger, the ritualization of violence, the transformation of fear into social glue. Displays of remains did not simply intimidate outsiders, they reinforced bonds within the group. To stand together before a wall of enemy skulls was to share in the memory of victory, to know that survival had been secured by collective force. Consider the children who grew up in such spaces. Their earliest memories framed by bones on display, their lullabies sung beneath skulls grinning from cave walls. For them, violence was not abstract. It was visible, ever present, woven into the very architecture of their lives. Fear, for them, was not only warning, it was inheritance. Archaeological speculation even suggests continuity into later ages. In some Neolithic sites, skulls appear deliberately curated, displayed separately from other bones, sometimes plastered or painted. While those may represent ancestors rather than enemies, the practice hints at a broader prehistoric tendency to use bones as symbols. If kin could be honored in bone, then surely enemies could be dishonored in the same medium. The duality of reverence and terror was born from the same material, the human skeleton. And what of sound? Bones, when struck, create resonance. Skulls, hollowed by time, echo when struck. Ribs, femurs, jawbones, all could become instruments. Could some rituals have incorporated sound, the rattling of bones, the drumming of skulls, amplifying fear through both sight and hearing? It is speculation, yes, but a chilling one. Imagine enemies approaching a cave only to hear, "Carried on the wind," the hollow clatter of bones struck in rhythm. Fear becomes not just visual, but auditory. Speculative anthropology also suggests another angle, the transformation of bones into boundaries. Instead of building walls of wood or stone, which required resources and time, prehistoric groups may have marked territory with human remains. Bones as borderlines, skulls as sentinels. To cross such a threshold was to step knowingly into danger. This, then, was the ritual of fear, violence extended beyond the act of killing, prolonged into spectacle. The body became not only a victim, but a signpost. Bones no longer belonged to the dead, they belonged to the living, as tools of intimidation, as reminders of power. But here lies the most haunting truth. These rituals were not merely about scaring others away. They also reshaped the humans who performed them. To participate in the display of bones was to normalize violence, to fold it into the rhythm of daily life. Over time, the shock diminished, replaced by expectation. Fear, once raw and paralyzing, became ritualized, domesticated, part of culture. And yet, even as bones-lined cave mouths and skulls stared hollow into the night, another kind of war brewed beneath the surface. For it was not only between tribes, not only sapiens against sapiens. It was sapiens against Neanderthals once more, two species clashing not just with weapons and fear, but with existence itself on the line. The Ice Age world was in constant motion. Glaciers advanced and retreated, reshaping valleys, swallowing rivers, carving the land into shifting arenas of survival. In these unstable landscapes, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were drawn into repeated collision, not by choice, but by necessity. For every warming spell that opened forests, for every freezing winter that shrank resources, the two species found themselves pressed against one another, competing for caves, for herds, for life itself. Archaeological records reveal the depth of this collision. Many Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of violent death, skulls fractured, ribs pierced by spear points, bones marked by trauma inflicted not by animals, but by other humans. These are not isolated accidents. They form a pattern, one that suggests encounters between Neanderthals and sapiens were as often violent as they were fleeting. And yet, the story is not simple annihilation. Genetic studies reveal that Neanderthals live on within us. Interbreeding occurred, leaving traces in our DNA that persist today. Genes affecting immunity, metabolism, even the way our skin responds to sunlight. This means that alongside conflict, there was intimacy. Alongside war, there was union, but the balance tilted toward violence. For every child born of mixed lineage, others died in raids. For every shared fire, there were caves filled with the remains of the fallen. The coexistence of sapiens and Neanderthals was not peaceful overlap. It was competition sharpened by scarcity, a rivalry spanning tens of thousands of years. Picture a cold evening in a valley where mammoth herds once roamed. A band of Neanderthals huddles around a fire, their powerful bodies built for endurance against the cold. They have hunted successfully, meat roasting over flames. From the tree line beyond, a group of sapiens watches silently. Leaner, quicker, better adapted for endurance rather than brute strength, they see the meat, the fire, the shelter. Hunger gnaws at their bellies. They weigh the risk. To attack is dangerous, but to starve is worse. This was the choice of prehistory, violence or hunger, conflict or extinction, and again, humans chose conflict. The archaeological traces whisper of these encounters. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal remains show both compassion and violence. Individuals with crippling injuries who were cared for by their groups, but also others whose lives ended by deliberate blows. Such duality reflects the paradox of Neanderthal life. Deeply social, protective of their kin, yet entangled in cycles of violence when survival demanded it. Speculation invites us to imagine the psychological impact of encountering the other. When sapiens first saw Neanderthals, what did they think? Did they recognize something familiar in their faces, eyes, hands, gestures eerily human? Or did they see only difference, bodies thicker, brows heavier, voices strange, perhaps both? And in that uncanny familiarity, fear grew sharper. For to look upon a Neanderthal was to look into a mirror warped but recognizable, a mirror that whispered, "They could be us, but they are not." The competition was not only physical but ecological. Neanderthals thrived in colder climates, with stocky builds conserving heat. Sapiens, originating from Africa, carried adaptations for endurance and heat regulation. As climates shifted, the advantage swung like a pendulum. During harsh winters, Neanderthals held their ground. During warming periods, sapiens expanded into new territories. The overlap was inevitable, and in those overlaps, violence followed. Imagine the clash. Neanderthals with thrusting spears, built for close combat, stepping into battle with explosive force. Sapiens with lighter weapons, more mobile, striking from distance, retreating, encircling. One fought as fortress, the other as flowing river. Each encounter was a test of strategies, of bodies, of wills. And yet, despite Neanderthals' formidable strength, sapiens endured, perhaps not because they were stronger, but because they were many. Networks of sapiens bands connected across landscapes, sharing knowledge, sharing tactics, reinforcing one another. Neanderthals, more isolated in their groups, may have been at a disadvantage when faced with repeated coordinated pressure. Speculation suggests another factor: memory. Sapiens may have carried stories of raids, warnings passed orally across generations. To know the tactics of an enemy before encountering them was advantage beyond weaponry. If one band fell to Neanderthal ambush, others may have learned from the survivors, adapting strategies. Knowledge became weapon, carried not in hands but in words. But the bones remind us of the cost. At sites across Europe, Neanderthal remains bear the scars of this rivalry. A fractured skull here, a spear point lodged in bone there. Some died instantly, others lived long enough for their wounds to heal crookedly, only to face violence again. Each scar is a record of the war between species, written not in chronicles, but in calcium. And through all this, interbreeding wove the two lineages together, a paradox of intimacy and violence, to fight and to mate, to kill and to merge. Perhaps love and war were inseparable in this age. Each encounter a roll of fate. Will this stranger become kin or enemy? The DNA in our veins today carries the answer: both. The competition between sapiens and Neanderthals was not brief. It stretched for tens of millennia, as long as all of recorded history since the first cities. Imagine generation after generation growing up knowing that the other species existed, knowing they might one day face them across firelight. The wars of prehistory were not singular battles, but an atmosphere, a constant presence, a shadow on the horizon. And so, the question arises: what finally tipped the balance? Why did one species endure while the other faded into memory and bone? To explore that, we must step further into speculation, into the idea that sapiens did not merely outlast Neanderthals, but actively hunted them into extinction. Picture the last Neanderthals. Small, scattered groups clinging to survival in the cold recesses of Ice Age Europe. Their fires flicker low in caves overlooking valleys now dominated by sapiens. Their numbers dwindle, their hunting grounds shrink, and each season grows harder than the one before. By the time of their disappearance around 40 years ago, they were a species pressed to the brink. But what if their end was not just a fading away? What if their extinction was deliberate? Speculation leads us here. Sapiens may not have merely outlasted Neanderthals. They may have exterminated them. Archaeological evidence whispers of this possibility. The violent injuries recorded on Neanderthal remains: skulls fractured, ribs pierced by weapons, skeletons burned and discarded paint a picture of conflict that was not isolated but repeated. If sapiens encountered Neanderthals again and again across thousands of years, could their intent have shifted from competition to elimination? Consider the logic of survival. Every cave held by Neanderthals was one fewer shelter for sapiens. Every herd they hunted was meat denied. Every fire they tended was a threat of rivals too close. For sapiens seeking expansion, coexistence may not have been tolerable. The solution, grim but effective, was extermination. Imagine a campaign not of armies, but of generations. Sapiens bands moving steadily through valleys and mountains, pushing Neanderthals from one cave to the next, each raid chipping away at their numbers, each ambush leaving fewer survivors. Over centuries, the attrition mounted. What began as skirmishes became extermination by accumulation, until Neanderthals were no longer a presence but a memory. Speculation goes further. Perhaps sapiens targeted not only groups but entire lineages. To wipe out a family, to absorb or kill their children, was to erase the possibility of future rivals. In this way, extermination was not only physical but generational. The strategy was simple: ensure no Neanderthals remained to grow into tomorrow's competitors. And yet, this extermination was not absolute in one sense. Interbreeding left traces of Neanderthal blood within sapiens. The paradox is haunting. While sapiens may have hunted Neanderthals into extinction, they also absorbed them. Their bodies vanished, but their genes lived on, hidden in our DNA. Survival through extermination, but also through absorption. Imagine the perspective of the last Neanderthal band. Their kin already gone, their territories lost. They hide in caves where food grows scarce. Each fire they light risks discovery. Each hunt risks confrontation. They must have known they were hunted. They must have felt the press of extinction not as an abstract, but as a daily truth. And imagine the sapiens hunters. They would not have seen themselves as destroyers of a species. To them, Neanderthals were rivals, competitors for food and space. Killing them was no more than survival. Yet in their persistence, in their relentless expansion, they accomplished something unprecedented: the elimination of another human species. Speculation suggests this was the first genocide, the first deliberate extinction carried out not by climate or catastrophe, but by human hands. If so, it reshaped the world forever. For when the Neanderthals were gone, sapiens stood alone, the sole inheritors of humanity's future. Archaeology cannot tell us intent. It shows only scars and absences, but the pattern is telling. Neanderthals vanish shortly after sapiens spread into their territories. Their final refuges, in caves across Spain and Gibraltar, disappear in the archaeological record soon after sapiens arrive. Coincidence is possible. Climate shifts played a role, certainly, but the overlap is too close, the timing too sharp, to ignore the possibility of deliberate elimination. Consider the legacy of such extermination. To live in a world where the only rivals were other sapiens must have changed everything. Competition shifted inward, tribe against tribe, human against human. But the memory of Neanderthals lingered, perhaps in stories, perhaps in myths. Survivors may have spoken of them as giants of the old world, fierce and dangerous. And in those stories perhaps was embedded the truth. We killed them, and in doing so, we secured our place. The thought is unsettling. It suggests that our species' first great triumph was not discovery, not invention, but elimination. That our rise was paved not only by creativity, but by extermination. To survive, sapiens became not only hunters of animals, but hunters of kin. And yet, the paradox remains. Neanderthals are gone, but they are not entirely lost. Their genes run in us still, carried silently across millennia. In a sense, sapiens did not defeat them utterly. We consumed them, as we had consumed prey, as we had consumed enemies. Their extinction was not erasure, but assimilation, folded into our survival. Still, the bones remind us of the violence. Fractured skulls, pierced ribs, shallow graves. These are the echoes of extinction by war. They tell us that our species' inheritance includes not only art and fire, but also the capacity to eliminate rivals completely. And so, the wars of prehistory were not merely tribal feuds. They were evolutionary crucibles, shaping not only who survived, but what kind of beings we became. The Neanderthals vanished, but their disappearance left us with a question that still haunts. Did we inherit the world through endurance, or through extermination? To answer, we must turn to what came next. For when Neanderthals were gone, the wars did not end. They turned inward, sapiens against sapiens, tribes locked in cycles of violence that would shape humanity long after the last Neanderthal fire went out. When the Neanderthals were gone, humanity stood alone. No more rival species hunted the same herds or claimed the same caves. And yet, peace did not follow. For the greatest rival of Homo sapiens was never only other kinds of humans, it was themselves. Across valleys, plains, and riverbanks, tribes of sapiens grew in number. Each tribe carried its own fire, its own language of gesture and voice, its own customs whispered into the night. But each tribe also carried hunger. And when hunger sharpened, when rivers ran low or game grew scarce, the eyes of one tribe inevitably turned toward the lands of another. Archaeological evidence bears witness to this inward turn of conflict. Mass graves at sites like Jebel Sahaba in the Nile Valley reveal entire groups cut down in violence. Skeletons bristle with stone points still embedded in bone, ribs punctured, skulls shattered. These are not the remains of accident or predator attack. They are the remains of battle sapiens against sapiens. Imagine the scale of such violence. Not armies, but dozens. Not battlefields, but riverbanks, where a fishing ground could be worth blood. Not fortresses, but caves, where the ownership of fire and shelter determined survival. In this world, the line between ally and enemy was drawn not by species, but by tribe. Speculation suggests these conflicts were not constant, but cyclical. Tribes might trade or intermarry in times of abundance, forging bonds across kinship lines. But when drought struck, when herds failed, those same bonds frayed. A cousin became a rival, a neighbor became a raider. Violence flared suddenly, brutally, then subsided only to rise again with the next scarcity. Picture two tribes meeting at a river. At first, they exchange words, gestures, perhaps even food, but the fish are fewer this season. Nets come back empty, tempers rise. One shove becomes a strike, one strike becomes a clash. Spears are thrust, stones hurled, blood flows into the water. By nightfall, one tribe flees, leaving behind bodies for vultures. The survivors of the other tribe drag the fish and nets back to their caves. Victory is measured not in glory, but in calories. What made these conflicts especially brutal was their intimacy. Unlike battles against Neanderthals, these were wars against people who looked and spoke more like kin than stranger. Perhaps they were kin split from a common ancestor only a few generations earlier. To kill in such circumstances was to fracture not only bone, but bloodlines. And yet, killing kin may have carried its own dark utility. To eliminate rival lineages was to reduce competition for resources, to secure more for one's own offspring. In this sense, tribal warfare was population control, a grim balance between reproduction and survival. Archaeology shows us the cost. At Jebel Sahaba, over half the skeletons in the mass grave bore marks of violent injury, many with multiple wounds, suggesting repeated clashes rather than a single event. Some victims were children, others were elderly. Violence spared no one, because in the arithmetic of survival, every member of a rival tribe was both burden and potential threat. Speculation extends beyond the bones. Perhaps these conflicts shaped the very rhythm of human life. The need for vigilance against raids encouraged stronger bonds within tribes, tighter circles of trust. Songs, stories, and rituals emphasized loyalty, courage, and the defense of kin. To survive, humans became storytellers of violence, teaching children from their earliest days that the world beyond the firelight was dangerous, that strangers could not be trusted. Yet, even in this darkness, there were moments of uneasy cooperation. Tribes sometimes traded stone, ochre, shells, and food. Alliances were made, perhaps sealed with marriage or shared hunts, but alliances were fragile. A single act of betrayal, a single raid in famine, could unravel them overnight. The cycle resumed. This was the essence of tribal conflict, survival through violence, tempered by fleeting peace, renewed by scarcity. War was not an interruption of life, it was woven into life, recurring like the seasons, as predictable as hunger itself. Imagine being a child in such a world. You learn to walk by the fire, clutching a sharpened stick. You hear stories not of heroes and myths, but of raids, of kin lost, of caves taken and retaken. You grow knowing that one day you may carry the spear, not only against animals but against people who speak as you do, who laugh as you do, who look like you. Violence is not anomaly, it is education. And so, when Neanderthals vanished, war did not vanish with them. It transformed. It became sapiens against sapiens, tribe against tribe, brother against brother. Conflict no longer determined the survival of species. It determined the survival of lineages, clans, names whispered around firelight. But this raises a darker truth. If tribes fought one another with such persistence, perhaps peace was never the natural state. Perhaps war was not the exception, but the constant. To explore this possibility, we must step deeper into speculation, into the idea that violence was not merely survival, but the only rhythm humanity ever truly knew. Consider this. In the long span of prehistory, how many days truly passed without violence? We picture moments of peace fires glowing, families resting, laughter echoing in caves. But even these were overshadowed by the knowledge that danger lurked just beyond the firelight. The rhythm of life was not built upon peace, but upon the expectation of conflict. Archaeological records reveal the weight of this cycle. Across Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites, bones bear not only the scars of hunting accidents but the unmistakable marks of human-inflicted wounds. Healed fractures tell of survivors carrying reminders of battle for years. Embedded stone points, left too deep to remove, tell of warriors who lived on with weapons still inside them. Each scar was both injury and story, proof that conflict was not isolated but continuous. Speculation suggests that peace, when it came, was less the default and more an intermission, a pause between raids, a season of plenty when rival tribes could avoid one another, but abundance never lasted. Herds moved, rivers shifted, winters froze, summers withered, scarcity returned, and with it, war. Imagine a tribe living through such cycles. In spring, alliances are made, hunts shared, food abundant. In summer, the rivers thin, disputes flare. By autumn, raids erupt, sudden and merciless. Winter is endured with the spoils of victory or with the losses of defeat. And when spring comes again, the pattern repeats. A cycle not of peace punctuated by war, but of war punctuated by fragile peace. Perhaps then war was not a distortion of human nature, but its foundation. To live meant to fight meant to survive, and survival itself carried within it the seeds of the next conflict. Consider the emotional inheritance this left. To grow up in a world where your parents carried scars from raids, where stories of conflict were the earliest lessons, meant that fear and vigilance were woven into identity. Children did not dream of peace, they prepared for conflict. Every tool learned was a potential weapon. Every story carried warnings. War was not taught as extraordinary. It was taught as ordinary. The cycle of violence may also explain the rise of social bonds. Loyalty, courage, cooperation qualities we often celebrate as noble may have been sharpened not in peace, but in the crucible of constant conflict. To survive, tribes needed cohesion. Warriors fought not only for themselves, but for kin. Those who did not stand together perished. In this way, war created culture as much as it destroyed it. Speculation takes us further. Could peace itself have been seen as dangerous? A tribe that grew too comfortable, too trusting, risked annihilation when rivals struck. Perhaps suspicion was the truest form of safety. Perhaps trust was a luxury only the dead afforded. If so, then the cycle was not only external but internal, etched into the psychology of early humans. Picture the quiet before dawn. A tribe sleeps, embers glowing low. One sentry remains awake, eyes scanning the horizon. He is not awake because war has begun. He is awake because war never ends. His vigilance is proof that peace is illusion, that safety must always be defended. The endless cycle is not only about battles fought. It is about the knowledge that battles will come. Archaeology adds a chilling reinforcement. At sites across Europe, mass graves reveal individuals killed not in isolated incidents but in repeated waves. Some bodies show fresh wounds, others healed injuries, suggesting that violence touched the same communities again and again. Generations grew up beneath the shadow of raids, each inheriting the scars of those before them. Speculation suggests that even rituals and myths may have been shaped by this cycle. Stories of spirits, ancestors, or gods could have been intertwined with the memory of conflict. Perhaps spirits of the dead were invoked not only for guidance, but as reminders of the price of vigilance. Myths may have carried warnings: do not wander far, do not trust strangers, do not forget the bones that lie buried in the valley. In this sense, the endless cycle was not only biological and ecological, it was cultural. It taught humans to see the world as hostile, survival as conditional, and violence as inevitable. And those lessons, passed down through countless generations, did not vanish with the end of prehistory. They echo still. But the cycle also had an evolutionary impact. Those who adapted to it, who learned vigilance, who built bonds of loyalty, who fought fiercely survived. Those who sought only peace may have vanished. War, then, was not merely an interruption of life. It was a force of selection, shaping humanity into what it became. Imagine once more the rhythm of this world. A child grows into an adult, learns to hunt, learns to fight, bears wounds, and eventually falls in battle. Their children repeat the pattern, inheriting both scars and stories. The cycle spins endlessly, war feeding survival, survival feeding war. And so, we arrive at the sobering conclusion: peace may never have been our origin. Conflict may have been the constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. To survive was to fight, and to fight was to live. The endless cycle was not deviation from human nature, it was its rhythm, its heartbeat, its inheritance. But if conflict was constant, then another transformation loomed on the horizon. For as humans sharpened their tools and honed their violence, the weapons themselves began to change. Stones gave way to innovations more precise, more deadly, and with each new invention, the cycle of war grew sharper still. The story of war is often told as invention of weapons, of tactics, of strategy. But beneath the clash of spears and the rhythm of raids lies a colder truth. War was also regulation. For in the fragile world of small tribes, growth itself carried danger. Too many mouths to feed, too many fires to tend, too many hunters chasing too few herds. And when numbers swelled beyond what the land could sustain, war became nature's brutal hand, cutting populations back down to survival. Archaeology reveals this pattern in haunting detail. At Jebel Sahaba in the Nile Valley, one of the oldest known cemeteries of conflict, Dozens of skeletons bear the scars of repeated attacks, arrows embedded in bones, fractures from blows, wounds both healed and fresh. This was not a single massacre, but generations of recurring violence. The cycle of attack and reprisal acted as population check, preventing any one group from expanding too far. Imagine the precarious balance of such life. A band grows strong after a season of abundant hunting. Children survive winters that once would have claimed them. For a time, the group flourishes, but with flourishing comes strain. Meat runs thin, waterholes grow crowded, caves feel small. Neighbors notice the swelling numbers. Tensions rise. One raid later, half the tribe lies dead, the other half scattered. The balance resets. Speculation suggests that this brutal rhythm was not only inevitable, but essential. Without conflict, populations might have grown beyond the carrying capacity of their environment, leading to famine and collapse. War, as terrible as it was, acted as grim regulator. It cut numbers before hunger did. It ensured that those who survived had enough to live on. This does not mean war was conscious choice. No one sat around a fire plotting population control as policy. But in the larger scale of millennia, war functioned as such. It was the pressure valve of survival, triggered whenever growth strained the limits of land and resources. Picture two valleys side by side. In one, a tribe thrives, children numerous, hunts successful. In the other, resources dwindle, bellies ache. Eventually, those from the hungry valley look toward their neighbors with envy. The raid comes. Blood flows, survivors scatter, and in the aftermath, both valleys once again balance numbers to needs. War was not strategy here, it was ecology. Archaeological hints support this view. Burial sites show spikes of violent deaths in times when climate grew harsh, when herds shifted or rivers dried. Scarcity pushed groups to raid. Raid reduced populations. Populations adjusted to scarcity. In this way, violence and climate intertwined, each feeding the other in cycles of survival. Speculation also invites us to consider what this meant for memory and myth. Perhaps tribes explained these cycles not in terms of numbers and resources, but in stories of spirits or fate. War might have been seen as punishment, as cleansing, as the will of forces larger than themselves. But beneath the myth was biology. Populations trimmed, balance restored. The battlefield, then, was more than a place of blood. It was nature's ledger, balancing survival through subtraction. Each spear point lodged in bone, each skull fractured, was part of a larger equation. Too many became fewer, too few became stable, until the cycle repeated. Imagine the perspective of a child who lived through such cycles. One year, siblings are many. The next, after raids, the cave feels empty. To them, this was not anomaly. It was life's rhythm, growth and loss, abundance and blood. They grew knowing that survival was never only about hunting or gathering. It was also about fighting, about enduring the reductions war inevitably brought. And here lies a darker speculation. Perhaps war was not only tolerated but, in a grim way, relied upon. Tribes that survived cycles of violence were those that did not collapse under their own weight. War culled numbers, but also hardened survivors. Those who lived carried resilience, vigilance, and skills that peace alone could not forge. The battlefield as regulator was not a battlefield in the way we think of it now. There were no lines, no generals, no flags. It was a cave mouth, a river crossing, a forest edge. It was anywhere two groups met when resources grew scarce. It was sudden, brutal, decisive, and its outcome was always the same. Fewer mouths, lighter burdens, balance restored. Speculation stretches even further. What if war was one of the invisible forces that kept humanity alive through the long millennia before agriculture? Without it, populations might have outgrown their fragile ecosystems, collapsing under famine and disease. With it, growth was checked, hunger staved off, survival prolonged. In this view, war was not only tragedy, it was adaptation. And yet, this adaptation carried scars. Bones tell the story in fractures and embedded weapons, but memory tells it too. Tribes learned that survival was fragile, that growth invited conflict, that peace was temporary. These lessons shaped psychology, teaching caution, suspicion, and readiness for violence. They carved into human nature the belief that conflict is not accident, but inevitability. Picture again the rhythm of prehistory. A tribe grows, flourishes, strains its land, clashes with neighbors, loses numbers, stabilizes, grows again. An endless cycle, repeated across valleys, across continents, across tens of thousands of years. Each cycle etched into the bones of survivors, carried in their stories, inherited in their instincts. This, then, was war as population control, not planned, not chosen, but enacted through the endless struggles of survival. It was not war for empire or glory, it was war as balance, as nature's brutal hand, as the unseen regulator of humanity's fragile existence. But this realization raises another question. If war regulated numbers, did it also regulate behavior? Could the instinct to fight itself have become hardwired into humanity, etched not only into culture but into biology? To explore that possibility, we must step deeper into the idea that war was not only what we did, but who we became. Look deep into the fossil record, and you will find not only bones but behavior. Healed fractures, embedded spear points, skulls fractured by deliberate blows. They are not random. They repeat across continents, across ages, across tribes. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Conflict was not anomaly, it was inheritance. And so we must ask, was violence not only practiced but wired into us? Speculation leads us here. To fight was not just choice, it was instinct. To fight was to live. Consider the human body itself. Our shoulders evolved for throwing, giving us an accuracy unmatched in the animal kingdom. Our hands can grip not only tools but weapons, with precision and force. Our eyes face forward, tuned for depth perception, allowing us to aim at prey or at rivals. Even endurance running, the very trait that allowed us to chase animals across plains, also allowed us to pursue enemies until exhaustion brought them down. The body is not neutral, it is a weapon shaped by survival. But it is the mind that truly tells the story. Human memory is wired to remember threats more vividly than peace. Fear leaves deeper marks than comfort. Stories of raids, ambushes, and massacres would have spread more urgently than stories of calm seasons. This bias was not flaw, it was adaptation. Those who remembered violence survived it. Those who forgot perished. In this way, the instinct to expect conflict became woven into cognition. Imagine a child in prehistory. Their earliest lessons are not only how to throw a spear or light a fire, they are warnings. Stay close to the cave, watch the ridges, trust only your kin. Every scar on an elder's body is a story told, a lesson etched in flesh. In this way, the instinct to fear, to prepare, to fight, is taught before words themselves are fully formed. Violence is not only learned, it is inherited culturally and perhaps biologically. Archaeological hints support this. At sites like Jebel Sahaba, some skeletons show repeated injuries, healed wounds alongside fresh ones. These were people who lived through violence, adapted to it, expected it. War was not occasional, it was recurring. And those who endured were those who adapted to its rhythm, shaping both behavior and biology. Speculation extends into genetics. Certain stress responses, adrenaline surges, and fight-or-flight instincts may have been honed through millennia of conflict. The tribes who hesitated, who froze, who did not strike when threatened, those lineages likely vanished. The ones who endured were those whose instincts bent toward vigilance, aggression, and survival. In this way, War was not only cultural inheritance, it was natural selection. But this does not mean early humans reveled in violence without hesitation. The cost was great. Every battle risked lives, weakened tribes, spread fear. And yet, when the choice was fight or starve, fight or be erased, the instinct to fight prevailed. Peace could be imagined. War could not be ignored. Picture again the landscape of prehistory, valleys dotted with smoke, caves marked by bones, rivers carrying echoes of raids. In such a world, suspicion was survival. Strangers were danger. Violence was the logic of existence. To expect otherwise was to die. Speculation dares us to imagine that war was not merely an activity humans engaged in, but the very environment in which humanity evolved. Just as deserts shape camels and oceans shape fish, conflict shaped us. Cooperation grew stronger because war demanded it. Courage became valued because survival required it. Even empathy may have sharpened within the context of violence reserved for kin, denied to rivals. This raises an unsettling truth. What we call human nature may be inseparable from war. The instincts to defend, to retaliate, to form alliances, to remember enemies, these were not cultural accidents. They were the scaffolding of survival. And perhaps this is why the cycle of conflict never vanished, even as humanity changed. Agriculture came, cities rose, empires fell, yet wars continued. They did not emerge suddenly with civilization. They were older than writing, older than nations, older than history itself. War is not invention, it is inheritance. Imagine the legacy carried forward. The instinct to glance over one's shoulder at night, to flinch at sudden sounds, to distrust strangers, these are not quirks of fear. They are echoes of the world where every encounter could turn violent. Our restlessness, our readiness to defend, our fascination with weapons, all are threads woven in the long fabric of prehistoric conflict. Speculation invites us even deeper. Could it be that humans learned identity itself through conflict? To be us meant defining them. Kinship was sharpened in opposition. Tribes became meaningful not only by who they included, but by who they fought. In this way, violence was not only about survival of the body, it was about survival of meaning, of belonging, of story. And here lies the paradox. War destroyed, but it also created. It created tighter bonds within tribes, sharper instincts, clearer identities. Without war, perhaps humanity would have remained scattered, fragile, uncohesive. With war, humans became stronger not only in body, but in mind and culture. But this strength carried cost. War became not anomaly, but expectation. It carved itself into psychology, into biology, into memory. To fight was to live, and to live was to prepare for the next fight. This endless inheritance still echoes in us now, long after the caves and spears have faded. And so, when we look back on prehistory, we must see war not only as event, but as essence. It was not only what humans did, it was what they became. But the bones tell us one more truth. If violence was inheritance, it was also record. The scars, the embedded spear points, the fractured skulls, they preserve not only the act of war, but its permanence. Prehistory was written not in books, but in bodies. And to uncover this record, we must look closer at the evidence itself, at the bones that bear witness to the endless wars of our kind. For nearly 200 millennia, war was not the march of empires or the clash of nations. It was something raw, closer, and far more intimate. It was the strike of stone against bone, the blaze of fire in the night, the sudden ambush at the cave mouth. It was survival itself, fought not for borders on maps or crowns of kings, but for food, for shelter, for the right to see another dawn. Every scar on ancient skeletons, every spear point lodged in ribs, every skull shattered by a blow tells the same story. That conflict was the backdrop of human existence. To live in that world was to inherit its rhythm, to carry violence in memory, in instinct, in blood. The wars of prehistory were not battles to be won or lost. They were cycles, endless as the seasons, shaping who we became. And yet, even as we uncover the bones and trace their scars, one question remains. Did humanity create war as a tool of survival? Or was war already there, shaping humanity long before the first tool was sharpened? Did we invent violence, or did violence invent us? Perhaps the answer lies not in victories or defeats, but in the persistence of conflict itself. For though the caves are long abandoned and the forests of prehistory have given way to cities, the echoes remain. The same instincts that once gripped hands around stone spears still live in us, the vigilance, the suspicion, the readiness to strike. The inheritance of war lingers in our shadows, as much a part of us as language or fire. So let us end where it began, in the darkness of the forest. Two tribes approach, their fires faint in the distance, their breath white in the cold air. Each carries weapons of stone, each guarded by fear and hunger. For a moment they pause, staring across the shadows at faces both familiar and strange. Neither knows that what is about to unfold will not be a single clash, but part of a cycle stretching across millennia. Spears glint in the firelight. The silence breaks, and the blood that falls in that moment will echo, unbroken, all the way to us.